大家好，欢迎来到缓冲带。上期视频，我和我的美国朋友 Jordan 讨论了特朗普带来的社会分裂。这期我们来看一看 Jordan 如何应对家人投票给特朗普的现实，以及他对于沟通失败的反思。Okay, so we know that some of your family members voted Trump in 2016 and possibly this year as well. So have you tried to persuade any of them, to vote otherwise? And what is the result of that?
Yeah.
How pleasant or unpleasant was the conversation?
Yeah. So those conversations are often quite difficult, I think, and especially because my family, my nuclear family lives in New Zealand, and the rest of my family lives in the States. Is that we only really see each other, or we most often see each other through infrequent video calls, and so that time is quite precious.
Yeah.
But when we broach those subjects, I've tried on a number of occasions to speak with family members that I love dearly about different political issues, about the choices that they might make and who they support or don't support, quite often those discussions are, I would say, they can become contentious or difficult. So let me give an example.
Yeah, cool.
When I tried to speak with some very close family members about the problem of anthropogenic climate change, right? So climate change, human-caused emissions, things like that, right? A simple cause and effect process. I mean, really not terribly difficult at the most simple levels. But talking with these family members about climate change became very difficult because explaining it beyond the simple idea, the level of an idea, often requires an appeal to sort of scientific processes, cause and effect things, natural phenomena, things like that.
Yes.
And if those things are not already part of the things that they accept to be true, they just reject them out of hand. And so it's a non-starter. And so what can happen here is people will say a couple of things. One, they'll say, "You're just wrong." Another thing that they'll say across a number of different issues, especially social issues, is it's a generational gap. It's a generational issue. And so this is a thing that happens quite often when we address things like social justice. So when talking about these sorts of social issues with people, with family members, oftentimes the response that I get is just, it's a generational issue. And for them, that's what they mean to say is, I'm done with this conversation. Right.
Right. And
but
for them, does this mean they don't think there is a right or wrong answer on this, or they're just trying to avoid coming to a conclusion?
So personally, I think they're trying to avoid coming to a conclusion, but I think it's also meant to assert the idea that I've failed to understand what it is that they already know.
Okay.
Right? And so there's just not that. Yeah.
Okay. So I see what you mean. So this conversation, they cannot even start.
That's right. It's difficult to find,
because you can't find a common ground to start with.
This is precisely it. Is that to be productive in these spaces, you have to agree about something first.
Yes.
And if you can't agree about principles,
yeah,
or you can't agree about evidence,
okay,
then it's hard to generate conclusions.
Okay.
When you think about the divisive power that President Trump's presence in politics has had, I have very dear friends who have functionally ended their relationships with siblings over these political divisions, and not because not because they can't handle a conversation. It's that it just becomes too much, and people get so wrapped up in these things that they struggle to maintain the relationship through it.
Yeah.
It's just quite difficult, and rightly or wrongly, it is what it is. But anyway, back to the family, the conversations that we have. So I think you've heard me speak for some time now, and so you might imagine how I approach a problem like this. I try to use reasons to get through it, and it ends up that reasons aren't always the best tools to get through those conversations. In part because these things are quite often subjective; they're experience-driven, things like that. I can be describing a view of the world to somebody whose set of lived experiences doesn't track what I've said to them. The things that I say don't make sense to them.
Can you give me an example?
Yeah, sure. I've had a conversation with a dear family member where that person described President Trump to me as somebody who cares deeply about the American people and wants what's best for them. And
sounds familiar.
and sees President-elect Biden as like a self-interested, money-grubbing,
traditional politician.
Sure, yeah, the caricature, right? Yeah. The quite uncharitable caricature. And so, this person I was speaking with, their view of these two characters in the political space is inverted from how I see it.
I can say it's completely upside down.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so when you're in that space, it's difficult to generate. And this is one of the reasons why I try to leave personal assessments aside.
Yeah.
And try to focus on things like issues and how we're going to solve problems that we share. Because then you can leave aside sort of these subjective judgments about individuals and focus on things like what problem exists? Why does this problem exist? What sorts of tools do we have to address this problem?
Okay, so did that conversation get any more productive than the online conversation you had before?
When I have those conversations with family members, especially when it's over a video call or in person, I find them to be more tolerant of me and the things that I want to say and discuss to them.
Yeah.
But there just are limits, and quite often I'd run myself into a point where the person I was speaking with would say, well, look, you just don't get it. To me, they would say, you just don't get it. Right?
Do you want to say the same thing back to them?
Well, I mean, maybe at some deep emotional level, right? You want to say the same thing back.
Yeah.
But what they're really trying to say to me is that, from their view, they're trying their best to explain to me how they see things and why they think it is that way.
Okay.
And I'm failing to acknowledge what they see. People would use the word debate or argue. They would think that we are debating or arguing.
Okay, so there is a winning side and a losing side.
That's right. It's a fundamentally oppositional sort of a prospect here, where there are going to be winners and losers, and that's genuinely how they perceive that process. They say, oh, you're a good debater or you're a good arguer, and that's why you're winning in this conversation. That's really the opposite of what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to win or lose conversations. I'm really trying to sort of pull apart the pieces and look at them and help the people, genuinely help the people that I'm in conversation with more precisely articulate the things that they need to say. Because quite often, and that's a skill that we have as people who study politics, is we've got this set of very technical terms that we can use to more precisely sort of state the things that we mean in those spaces. And so that's the thing that I try to do.
In the U.S., there are a lot of Chinese immigrants, right? And there is an interesting phenomenon, which is that first-generation Chinese tend to vote for Trump, whereas the second-generation Chinese, their sons, their daughters, the young people, tend to vote for the Democrats. They're more progressive and more on the left. And this has caused a lot of, inner family division.
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So what is your advice for people who have not studied politics but want to resolve this kind of conflict?
So my best advice, a couple of components here. The first is that it's unlikely to be the case that you will perfectly disagree about everything with someone, that they will be perfectly wrong, and that you will be perfectly right.
Yeah.
So walking into those conversations with humility, with that sort of humility, I think is massively important. Understanding that everybody you're talking to is leading their own complicated and difficult life with its own struggles and stresses is a thing that's worth keeping in mind. You're talking to a flesh and blood human being and not some, two-dimensional caricature, right? And again, this idea that, two bits here. One, and these are associational. One is we bear this civic association, right? There's a common project here that we're all involved in. And in the American tradition, it's the development of a more perfect union.
Yeah.
It's not that you get utopia overnight. It's that we're working in this long-term incremental project to slowly and steadily, as quickly and as radically as possible, right? Which is often slowly and steadily, making progress toward what we think is a better, fairer, more just society. Yeah. Those are the goals that we're all pushing forward. We make different judgments about what fairness entails, about what justice entails, about what each person is due and why, and we have reasons for those things, and those reasons are reflected in our lived experiences. But the second associational piece there is that, especially when they're family members, and when they're, say for example your parents, right? Those people have sacrificed quite a lot for you to have the life that you have. Having a young child now.
Be grateful is that message.
Well, yes. Try to keep in mind that these people love you and they care about you, and you love them and care about them.
Yeah.
And you can disagree deeply about some very, very important things, and still try to get on with their lives.
特朗普带来的分裂不仅仅局限于美国，在任何国家，包括中国，都可以找到特别厌恶他的人，也能找到特别支持他的人。我们在反思这种分裂的时候，实际上是在反思生活在同一个地球上的我们，还能否在价值观、沟通方式、客观事实3个方面找到共识。当然，这个问题太大了，我没有答案 ，Jordan 也没有答案。我们能做的，只能是心怀善意的互相交流。谢谢观看。